displayed.
Hello, Yoram.
Hi, Pim. Good afternoon.
Hi. Good to see you.
Hello. Is everybody seeing the screen? I started sharing the presentation. Perfect. Yeah. I think, well, considering that we are connecting through the Teams, it's not yet 3 p.m. And again, considering that we are connecting through the Teams, which can be quite problematic to join during the first few minutes, let's give ourselves, I would say, around a 5 minutes welcome clock. Usually it's a 15 minutes right at the university, so let's do it a 5 minutes then. And yeah, and we'll be getting started. Hello. And a brief checking question, whether everybody can see the link to the full report of today's meeting in the chat. I placed it in the chat, but because I'm not sure if people before joining can access it, I wanted to double check. Welcome everyone, hello. If not, maybe I could ask you, Yoram, to place the link to the report one more time, just to make sure that it's right there on top if somebody wants to take a look, if not yet seen the report itself. And as I mentioned before, because people are still joining and we have a Teams meeting, so it can be a bit tricky at the beginning. So we'll start in after still more 2-3 minutes, perhaps, to get everybody chance to see to hear the welcoming words. And it's good to see you all. Hello, everyone. We'll be starting shortly. Just making sure that everybody can join. I guess maybe we'll give ourselves 1 or 2 more minutes. Okay, perhaps slowly we can start. I know that people will be still probably joining throughout the meeting, but to keep the silence, I don't know if you know, but there are different nations who have a different tolerability regarding silence on the meetings. The lowest are Brazilians; they can withstand only a few seconds of silence. So I guess it's better to already start talking, as we are also with the international audience today. Welcome everyone. It's a pleasure, and thank you so much for taking the time to meet with us today and we'll discuss and reflect about the findings from the report that we are going to present today. To the link to the report you can find in the chat. It's the report that we prepared together as an Apora Foundation, together with Laguna Collective and Opinion. It's a 14-month study that we did on the situation regarding the conditions of return. And the full report was published in March, and in the chat you can find the link to the website on which the report is published. However, today our aim is to, as I said before, discuss and reflect a little bit on the findings and to give ourselves space to see what type of implications are coming from these findings, and perhaps also discuss it with you from your reflections and your specialties, because the topic of return is of course very, very important, but also there are increasingly more studies about this topic, and of course it's a very practical issue, and this is something that happens while we speak. So I know that also among our participants today are people who are bringing this perspective of working in the field with the people who are actually returning. Therefore, very, very big thanks for joining us today and discussing this topic. A few organizational information. So first of all, the presentation today will take around 40 minutes, I presume, and will be divided into few parts. First, I will talk a little bit about the rationale of the study and about our sample, so who participated in our research, and about socio-demographic conditions related to return. Then my colleagues from Laguna Collective PIM and Afra will talk more about the specific metric that we use to understand the conditions of people who are returning. This is well-being, and why we chose it and what are the results of it. And then Tarek will take it over to discuss about what really explains well-being and how we can understand the implication of this specific category and the situation of people. And then at the end, I will conclude with a little bit of a few takeaways and also the policy implications of these findings. And then we'll open a space to discuss it. We hope that today we can be quite interactive. Therefore, if you have a very specific question or query why we are talking, feel free to just raise your hand and ask. I think I also look at my colleagues, and I hope that they will be okay with it. That's something related to immediate maybe reflections or immediate short questions that you would like to have while we are speaking about certain topic. Also, in case not to forget that something is already being mentioned. However, if you have something more, let me say, substantial, deep, or required discussion, put it please in the chat while we're discussing, or just keep your hand raised after we finish our presentation, and then we can dig in a little bit more into the specific topics. And I hope that's fine. I hope you can see the presentation well, and let me kick it off. Let me kick it off. Yes. My name is Mateusz Krawczyk. Yes, I did not present it myself. I'm the research lead at the Opora Foundation, and I was coordinating this project. And I will start by presenting a little bit information about the rationale and what is it actually about. So of course, as you perfectly know, the return is a highly sensitive and highly important topic, and it becomes more and more every day. What specifically strikes us to ask this, to ask and start to discuss this specific topic, is that while we know that return is being a topic of the discussion basically since the start of the Russian invasion on Ukraine in 2022. Because the return, as we'll also share about the data, was already happening back then. We know surprisingly little about the situation of the people who actually do return. And don't get me wrong, there is also, if you look at the report, there is a significant amount of data about the situation in Ukraine across the number of different groups and number of different regions. This is the very active field of research. However, what we wanted to specifically understand is the situation of people who were under temporary protection in the countries of European Union. So they had a specific legal status, and since then they decided to either close the status and come back to Ukraine, or they de facto came back to Ukraine without intentions to go back to Europe. So we took this decision-making aspect as a conditions of return. We're not really looking for the aspects of going really back and forward that much, but we're really looking forward to people who. If you can please mute your. Yes, thank you so much. Happy to have you with us, but please, if you would like to say something, please raise your hand so I can give you the floor. So as I was saying, we're looking at the people who were on the temporary protection in Europe and decided to return, and that was of course a very specific challenge. Because as though we have a lot of data about the situation in Ukraine, often those are not disintegrated into the specific mobility status of the people who were either, for example, they are internally displaced or refugees or returnees, and from where they're actually coming from, what was their situation, why they returned, and to what conditions they returned. That was still of a question mark. And of course, the data itself shows the significance of the problem. We have around 10 million Ukrainians displaced today. Around 5.7 reside abroad. That number changes every time. Every day, nearly 1.5 million people have returned. Although this is something that I already mentioned, it's important to notice again, when we talk about people who have returned, this significant amount of this number is the number that we take into account since 2022. And that is important to mention, and that's also something that we'll be sharing later on in our study, that a lot of people have returned within a few months after the start of the Russian invasion. We also take this into consideration in our study. However, it also means that the actual number of people who returned is something also of a question mark. Also, how do we understand in this specific situation return? Who is a returnees? Why do you return? From where and to what? That's why I think the discussion about sample and the discussion about like what is actional conditions it needs to be always analyzed in a kind of a disintegrated way to know what we are talking about first, because each situation can be very different. And as I said, in this specific study, we are looking specifically at the people who were at the temporary protection in Europe, and since they decided to return, they decided to return. And why, again, this is urgent. I would like to give you 3 additional examples and reasons why we thought that this study is very important to conduct. First of all, it's a matter of a discourse. So as a part of this studies, you can also see it in our report. We conducted a discourse analysis of how return is being framed and discussed in the policy making since 2022. And perhaps some of you recognize, I think that was one of the triggering moment and also the start of the very big discussion about the return was the New Year's speech of the President Zelensky back in 2022 and between 2022 and 2023, when he mentioned that returning is about rebuilding soul of the nation, and that also it's important from the perspective of also demographic, economic perspective, but also from the perspective of I believe the specific saying was there that everybody needs to decide whether you are a refugee or you are a citizen, and that was a specific, significant emotional stimulant regarding the return that a lot of people who are displaced people from Ukraine in European Union countries were discussing, and that was of course significant importance. So although we do have factors, objective factors related to the economic and demographic situations of Ukraine, I believe there was even a Bloomberg report from last year that Ukraine needs at least 10 million people to return in order to still have a competitive economy by the next decade. So demographic economic factors are clear. That again, situations of returnees are a specific group of population that I think that's what we wanted to ask ourselves with the whole framework of discussion of recovery and reconstructions. We wanted to see whether the people who are actually returning can indeed contribute to the recovery and reconstruction in a way how it is often framed in the discourse analysis. But there are more factors to consider. I would say that another one also very important is there something that is in the literature called protection gap. So also it's the first time ever that we are dealing with a situation of the activation of the temporary protection in European Union. That has never happened before. So I think for all of us in member states, in different member states, it's really a stress test towards under what conditions we are dealing with a mass migration related to the situation of ongoing war. This is not something covered by the Geneva Conventions on the refugee status. So we have a very new reality that we are dealing here with, and the specific form of uncertainty. And I think also the divergent conditions in the member states related to the return to the settlement situations have created a difficult conditions for a lot of displaced people. And there are again many reports already describing the situations related to for example, qualifications recognition, work under the qualifications that you have, precarious conditions related to housing or labor market that were also evident in our study that may have an influence on whether people can stay in the European Union countries or return to Ukraine. And I think a specific aspect of the protection gap, as it was framed, so what happens when the temporary protection ends, whether people will still have a status to stay in the European countries, under which conditions they can reside right now, and whether they can allow themselves, for example, there was a significant case, for example, back in Poland in 2023, when the housing subsidy was removed in June 2023, and then we had also data about a significant number of people who since then returned to Ukraine because they were simply not able to afford a housing in the quite competitive rental market in Poland. So those factors related to the settlement conditions also create a conditions that require us to investigate why and how the return is happening, as it's not something that is technically covered by, as I said, Geneva Conventions or standard repatriation frameworks. And finally, what I already mentioned at the beginning, what is return and who is really a returnee? That is a significant question mark that I think we all still have, and we can of course use different metrics to try to understand it and define it. I think the most important part right now is the situation of returnees is so far known, and there are significant reports, for example, by IOM about the situations of returnees and other organizations, but often we know about the situations of returnees once they become internally displaced people. That's also something that we found in our study. If they are not internally displaced people, often, as we will be talking a little bit later, they are simply returning home, right? So it's not a very specific legal status that makes you be entitled to any kind of additional service or support, either state or civil society support. So that means also if we are dealing with a significant amount of people who are under these specific conditions, we need to understand if there is anything that can be done either by the state or by the organizations that can support the specific people, even like how do we define the specific status and what influences it. And that was also, it was quite difficult to understand and reach. And I think that's something that maybe this study is contributing the most, which is how do we ask questions about the situation of returnees? What actually variables we are taking into consideration to investigate the situation? That is something that my colleagues will be talking a little bit more. We try to be quite holistic, so we designed a quite big survey that was created out of a little bit over 70 questions, divided into 3 rounds, where we ask questions about socio-demographic aspects. We asked focus questions related to well-being metrics that will be discussed by my colleagues. And we also ask more specific questions related to living conditions, housing, security, mobility, interactions, assistance, and all the other factors that we'll try to present today and we present in our report. But also knowing that not everything can we learn just by the survey, we also deployed a researcher who was having qualitative researchers with the people who actually return, trying to deepen a little bit our quantitative, quantitative feedback. We are very grateful and with the cooperations with different Ukrainian civil society network that spread our survey, and I think it was very important for us to have a full nation coverage. That was very important, that we didn't focus on any specific region, but we took all Ukraine into consideration, different aspects of cities versus municipalities versus different regions, to really see a quite holistic picture of what return is. And that's a little bit about the rationale behind it and about our study. That will be much more deeper presented by my colleagues later on, who will explain to you how we did the analysis. What I will do at the moment is try to go very briefly by the aspects of some of our findings, especially more from the socio-demographic and the living conditions perspective. So first, I would like you would like to ask to answer ourselves, who are returnees exactly? And I think at the beginning there won't be too much surprise for you that, of course, just as the people who are with the refugee experience are majority women, of course, majority of returnees, we also have female, over 84% of the whole group. Majority of them are married or living with a partner or are in a relationship. And of course, majority of them, that's very important, have a care responsibilities. Over 60% of people who are in our sample declare that they have ongoing care responsibilities, either for children or adults or both. I think what also is important to mention, that a lot of people from our interviews who were discussing the caregiving responsibilities were mentioning that this is also a significant reason why they returned to Ukraine. So often there was somebody simply to take care of, sometimes elderly, that they have from their families, and they had to make this decision. Even though there is 49% who declare being married or living with a partner, as we put it in a single category, I would like to disintegrate this part a little bit more, because this is important. It's important to mention, and that's all of our qualitative interviews indicated the same thing. Even though people are often saying that they are married or living with a partner, what is actually hiding behind this is that often we have a situation when, for example, women is coming back, but the husband is either staying in the European Union countries still looking for work, or, for example, is on the front line fighting in the war. So even though a lot of people have declared that they are in a relationship status, majority of those people who we interviewed are declaring and actually existing as a single parent household or single caregiving household. So it's important to break this down, because this can be misleading, thinking that we have to do with this situation. So what we have de facto is majority women population in a relationship, but majority taking care of the dependents on themselves, and majority having a caregiving responsibilities. Few of the quotes that I will try to share with you also today is about a woman, for example, who was coming back from Poland, and she was citing a specific reasons related to simply not, I would say, good integration outcomes for her back in Poland when she was coming back because of her caregiving responsibilities for her daughter, who didn't manage to integrate well back in Poland. And as you can see, for example, my husband stayed at work, which is what I was briefly discussing before, that even though we have the relationships here, we often have a situation that is actually the single household. Coming forward with the information, we also know that we have a quite high educated populations here. A majority of people, actually over 30%, are declaring that they have a master's degree. That is also translating later to the well-being aspect. I will not be discussing this too much. However, this is a significant amount. But even though we have mostly women, mostly with caregiving responsibilities, mostly single households, and mostly well-educated, and as you can see here, mostly employed. So we have 48 plus 15%, around 63% of people in our survey who declare that they are employed. The actual living conditions of those people is much more precarious. And here I would like to turn your attention to yet another quote from our interviews, because even though a lot of people declare that they are working, yes, full-time, yes, part-time, the actual working conditions in Ukraine, and you can also refer to our report and to other reports that are describing this, are quite precarious. So even though we have a population who are quite high educated, majority of them were declaring that they are working below their actual qualifications, similar as actually we have situations for those people back in Europe, because also of how the current labor market in Ukraine is structured. I mean, you can also read it in our report, but for example, there is a significant shortage for male-dominated sectors, which is not correlated very much with the actual people who are in our survey who returned. So they are often taking more precarious, part-time type of work, but because of also situation of the economy, they are not being met with the salaries that are actually being able to care for their basic needs. People also come with debts, right? People are not getting paid on time, and even though that they are mostly employed, people were saying quite a significant lack of resources to cover for very basic needs like food, housing, healthcare. Healthcare is one of the most important one, education, and I think that's the most important takeaway. So even though we have this type of population, and even though people are actually working, this work is often not enough to cover for their basic needs, which will be deepened a little bit later on when we'll be discussing what does it mean for their well-being scores. Let's continue. As I said, we were trying to grasp situations of people from all over the Ukraine, and here we also have information about if people did not return to their home region where they relocated. So as you can see, majority of people returned to their home region. It's around 67%. Although 1/3 did not, and this 1/3 became what I was saying before, internally displaced person. So they filled what is already a significant proportion of internally displaced people in Ukraine. The people who return, around 1/3 of them, according to our survey, became internally displaced people, and they often relocated to the regions that you have mentioned here. It's of course the majority of people went to Kiev, but we have quite significant present also in Dnipropetrovsk, in Lviv, in Zakarpattia, in other regions. Of course, well, you can see the whole Ukraine is included here. So it's really depends. For many reasons, we try to investigate those reasons. And for example, this is because some people have just a family that in the neighborhood regions, right, that they could relocate somewhere, or they have some kind of a work opportunities and stability. Usually people had some connections with the regions to which they moved to. So it was not random. However, it still happened in a quite significant aspects. And because people are from all over Ukraine, the peoples who seek refuge and later on return, we also have the whole Ukraine as a potential relocation region. Now, as you may also see from the policy discussion, we've been having quite a big discussion about the so-called safe regions and what does it actually mean. Even some countries like Switzerland and Norway were discussing implementing solutions that, for example, some people who return, for example, from the Western Ukraine can return there because they are so considered safe. And I think like my colleagues will be talking about it a little bit more later on, but we also have, no matter the region really of where people come from, we have quite significant statistics related to feeling unsafe or very unsafe. We have over 60% of people who said that they feel very unsafe and unsafe. And I think here there are also quite a significant qualitative interviews that we conducted to people who, for example, return to Odessa or to other regions. I think we will have a quote, we'll have a quote exactly here, of people who did return to their relatively more safe region, but since then, for example, the shelling happened or some other situations. And once we had a family who returned right after 24 hours after the shelling happened, even though they returned with the intention to stay, so which is also something that we took into the consideration as our preconditions for a sample, so intention to return. And people did came with the intention to return and to stay, but because of the actual safety conditions that they witnessed on site, they decided to return again, which is a significant risk currently of a secondary displacement. Yes, we also try to investigate mobility factors. This is a quite significant findings, and I would let my colleagues talk more about it. And as you can see, I also mentioned this before, that a significant number of returnees happened right after the invasion started. So it was 2023 mostly that happened, and we have also in our survey more than a year ago. Within the last 3 months, 3.6 months, and 6 and 12. So majority of people returned a significant while ago. Right now, although it's still happening, it's again difficult to fully track it. But what I would like to turn your attention to specifically is the reflections of our respondents to planning to stay in their current locations or not. And here you can see that, like, even though, around 50% plan to stay in the current locations, we have a lot of people who are simply unsure. So we have either considering moving to their previous country of residence or being unsure. Over 60% of people who are considering this, which again raises this problem of secondary displacement that we'll be talking a little bit more later on. Moreover, about mobility, majority of people did not travel or relocated to another country. Again, that's why I said, are you considering moving back abroad? Yes or not sure is over 60% of people. And now will be, yes, that's why I'm saying risk of secondary displacement. People kept, for example, their flat in Poland. People kept their job or some kind of a capital back in the EU member states, hoping that it can be useful, or, for example, if they will be forced to return. And now we'll be going more into the depth, so about the situation of people from the perspective of well-being. And here I would like to give a floor to my colleagues, Pim and Afra, to introduce us to the topic. I hope you can hear us well, and you can take the floor. And please tell me whenever you wanna switch the slides.
Okay, thanks a lot, Mateusz. There was one question in the chat about employment. I don't know if you want to address that one first before I go on.
If it was about employment and if it's about the chat, so I guess maybe not right away quick question, so maybe we can leave it after our presentation.
Good. So maybe you can go to the next slide. Why would we measure well-being? And of course, that is because you would like to assume that if people return, they would contribute to the recovery of the country and the society and the communities. But well, this is not the case, obviously, automatically, and that this is because mental problems may persist or may arise when having returned, and mental problems always seriously impact both physical health and interpersonal relations, social functioning, one's socio-economic status, and thereby the social cohesion. So it's not automatically true that if people return, and they might develop then mental health problems, so they cannot very well contribute to the reconstruction and the rebuilding of the country. Next slide, please. I first want to introduce now my collaborators, and especially Samrat Ghane, who unfortunately is not capable of attending this meeting. He has contributed substantially to this part of the study. Afra, you will see after my presentation, and my name is Pim Scholte. So next slide, please. There is many data on the well-being of refugees, and unfortunately, it's mostly done, these studies, by studying the prevalence rates of mental health symptoms, and that is mainly about post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and anxiety, being the most prevalent symptoms and disorders in refugee populations. But there's a huge limitation to that, because well-being is not only about the lack of symptoms and not presence, the non-presence of symptoms, There's more to well-being than only that, but also because these are studies that use survey instruments, and these are self-report instruments. So that easily leads to overestimation. And besides that, you don't know if these instruments are valid all over different cultures and language groups. So these are quite limited perspectives that you get there. But still, there is a high prevalence of symptoms, and that is because not only there's pre-migration stressors that might still cause all of these problems, like depression and PTSD symptoms, and of course, these pre-migration stressors are like insecurity, repression, violence, loss, all of that comes with war and violence. But also there's ongoing stresses like legal status problems, discrimination, marginalization, unemployment, lack of purpose in life, all of that. So that leads to, that reinforces already present mental health problems, but it also may elicit them. We don't know much about return. I'm sorry, one back, please, Mateusz.
Yeah, it's yours.
Yeah, okay, sorry. We don't know much about returning refugees, but what we know is that reintegration comes, of course, with new stresses, because problems that are there may negatively affect an already fragile well-being. So we have to have a look at that. Okay, next, please. And now the concept of well-being is far broader than the non-presence of psychiatric symptoms or disorders. And there's different theories, different models trying to define and to comprehend what actually is well-being and identify factors contributing to well-being. In fact, you can say it is about a state that you are in, and it is the subjective feeling and the objective state that you are in. So the subjective feeling may be things like happiness and satisfaction. An objective state, of course, is how do you really function? Are you able of fulfilling personal potentials? Do you have the feeling that you have control over your life? Do you have the feeling that you have a purpose in life? Things like that. Do you have nice relationships as well on the individual level as on community level? All of that. Now, there's other concepts very much related to well-being. Health is such one. And many people consider health as part of well-being. And then they say that is the objective part of well-being. So health then will be defined as something that you can objectify, which is not always completely true. For instance, in mental health, there's many subjective manifestations that are a factor impacting your feeling of mental health. So health is not only the objective state, but you could say health, physical health at least, is part of well-being at all, and of course mental health as well. Another closely related concept is flourishing, and there's many overlaps also between the concept of well-being and flourishing. But flourishing mostly is considered as the optimal state of well-being, and this is on the individual and on the social element. And this is about positive emotions, vitality, a sense of meaning of life, and being engaged to your surroundings, and social and interpersonal connectedness. So that is what is flourishing about. Now, next slide, please. There's different theories here again on well-being. And for instance, Reef and Dissy and Ryan have designed these models. They mostly overlap, and they have to try to identify the main factors contributing to well-being. And what you can see here is these are the most commonly mentioned factors, like self-acceptance, which of course is, are you happy with the way you are? Even with the weaknesses that you have, do you really accept your strengths and weaknesses? Do you have in personal growth a feeling that you are capable of developing yourself in the direction that you wish? Do you have the feeling that your life makes sense, that you have certain purposes, that you have positive relations with others, that you have mastery and competence in let's say, being confronted with the environment? We call that agency sometimes. There's concepts like sense of coherence. They're all related to the feeling that you can master your environment. And then autonomy, of course, is about independence and self-determination. So well-being factors are mostly mentioned like these. If we look at flourishing, next slide, please, there's other scholars that have had models on it, theories. The main models you can see here. And if we go to the next slide, then you can see what factors these models have identified. And if you go with your eyes over these factors, then you can see there's overlap between flourishing and well-being. These are the flourishing models. And there's also overlap between the different theories on flourishing. And in the model of Keys, the left column there, he mentioned the most factors, of course, but there's also other models that seem to be, well, they say valid and sometimes even valid across cultures. So if you want to measure well-being, you have to make a choice. Which instruments are we going to use, and which factors do these instruments cover? And we have come up with a certain choice, and I give the floor now to Afra, my colleague, who will explain why we made this choice and which instruments we came up with. Thank you.
Thank you, Pim. So the first scale that we chose to measure well-being is the Short Warwick Edinburgh Mental Well-being Scale, which is abbreviated as SWEMWEBS. And this is a scale that is widely used internationally across many populations and settings. It has been validated in many different populations, so it's a very established scale. It consists of 7 items, and I'll briefly go over them so that you get a feeling of what this scale consists of. The questions are: I've been feeling optimistic about the future, I've been feeling useful, I've been feeling relaxed, I've been dealing with problems well, I've been thinking clearly, I've been feeling close to other people, and I've been able to make up my own mind about things. So those are the items. So go ahead. Yeah, so what this measures is the emotional functioning and psychological resources. And it's this scale is sensitive to short-term changes, which is a very useful measure in unstable wartime contexts, but also has its limitations, which is why we chose to add a second questionnaire. So we can go to the next slide, which is the MHCSF. And this is the mental health continuum, the short form, which still consists of 14 items. And those 14 items can be divided in 3 categories: emotional well-being, social well-being, and psychological well-being. And I will take you through a question out of each of those categories because I don't want to go over all 14 items. But if you look at emotional well-being, a question is: during the past month, how often did you feel happy? Or for social well-being, how often did you feel that you had something important to contribute to society? And for psychological well-being, how often did you feel that you liked most parts of your personality? So just to get a feeling of the different items on the scale. Next slide. So what this scale measures is emotional, psychological, and social well-being within the 3 categories. And it's important for assessing reintegration and a sense of belonging. So I can understand this is a lot of information, so I made an overview of the 2 scales. Next slide, please, so that you can compare the 2 and understand the differences. And what I want you to take away from today's presentation is what is written under key strength. So the SWEMWEBS captures how people manage everyday life, and the MHCSF captures the full spectrum of mental health, including social dimension. So those are 2 different angles to look at well-being, and I think together they cover the full spectrum, or a large part of the spectrum that Pim just explained of the well-being spectrum. All right. Sorry, let me just the last. Maybe if you still are not with me, let's look at the last line. What it tells you: SWEMWEBS. Can this person function in daily life? MHCSF. what is this person's overall mental health state. So just try to keep that in mind. Let's continue with the outcomes. So on SwimWebs, we found that about half of the people fell into moderate well-being, 42% fell into low well-being, and only 5% into high well-being. Yeah, I think that's what it is. And if you look at some of the items, I think these are the items that were, yeah, have to help me here a little bit. I think these were the items that scored most, yeah, what was it? That had the most extremes, the highest scores.
Yeah, I think here we have like the things like, for example, I've been able to make my own mind about things was the highest score, or about, for example, optimistic and relaxed have the lowest score.
Exactly. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Okay, so yeah, those are the outcomes for the SwimWebs. And then for the other scale, we can continue to the next slide. For the other scale, we found that it's divided into three parts, and those three parts are quite almost the same size. There's you know, there's 33.5% that is languishing, then there is 37.5% which is moderately mentally healthy, which is of course the largest chunk, and then 29.1% is flourishing. Okay, let's continue with the next slide. So some of the items that scored the highest is how often in the past month did you feel happy? How often in the past month did you feel interested in life? And how often in the past month did you feel satisfied with your life? Okay, let's continue. So the lowest scoring items on this, this is the, yeah, oh, sorry. Okay, sorry. Let's go. Yeah, so this is the social well-being questions of the second scale. The lowest scoring items were society is becoming a better place for people like me. The way society works makes sense to me. The feeling of belonging to a community and that I have something important to contribute to society. Okay, let's continue. So here is a quote of somebody, and this is about their feelings about the future. They said, we drank coffee in Europe while they lived in basements. Now they won't speak to me. So I think this clearly reflects, you know, how this person feels about their current situation. And then about psychological well-being, the highest areas were managing daily responsibilities, feeling confident, expressing ideas, and having some sense of direction or meaning, and liking most parts of their personality. All right. Let's see. The next slide is the lower areas of the psychological well-being was feeling warm, trusting relationships, and feeling challenged to grow or develop. I think this is broadly the outcomes of those two scales. I think for now, Tarek will continue with some of the cross comparisons on these two scales.
Thank you, Afra.
Yeah, sure.
To do that, I would suggest I share my own screen. That might be easier.
Yes, go ahead.
I'm doing so now. Oh. Well, apparently, I might be prevented from doing so by the machine.
Maybe we can give you the administrator rights in case you don't have it. And then probably you will be able to. 1 second.
I think I should be
You
able
are
to.
already organizing, so.
Yeah. I'll need just 1 moment. Okay. Okay. Seems to be running into the 5 p.m. Beirut time technical difficulties section. So I would suggest, Mateusz, that you yourself share it, and we'll see how it goes. We lose the animation / triggers, but that should be fine. So my name is Tarek Jaber. I'm a researcher at Upinion. And in the next 10 to 15 minutes, I'll be briefly going over our methodology and present some key findings from our quantitative analysis. So go ahead, Mateusz. As already mentioned, we conducted a survey through our digital engagement platform, and it is specifically designed to facilitate two-way engagement with communities in hard-to-reach areas. What this means is that we go beyond extractive data collection methods. We engage with participants over time, and we regularly share back with them insights and supportive information. Our outreach strategy was multi-pronged, so it incorporated both physical and digital elements, which ultimately allowed us to securely engage with returnees across Ukraine with a nationwide sample, as mentioned by Mateusz, including those in frontline regions, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, for example. Participation was possible regardless of geography and time, and people could answer the questions at their own pace. So out of 340 respondents, 324 Ukrainian returnees met our eligibility criteria. So those who had not left Ukraine, who were abroad at the time of data collection, or who were below the age of 18 were excluded from our analyses. And first, we conducted descriptive statistics to assess returnees' socio-demographic and return characteristics, as well as their mental well-being. And some of these results were already presented by Mateusz, Pim, and Afra. Then we sought to understand what factors affect mental well-being. And for that, we conducted both bivariate and multivariate analyses. For bivariate analyses, we conducted chi-square test for categorical explanatory variables and Cochrane-Armitage tests for ordinal variables. And these included education level, date of return to Ukraine, and perceived safety. The analyses, as mentioned on the slide, were really conducted separately for both of these scales, and our outcome variable was the dichotomized well-being categories. In other words, to make it explicit, low mental well-being versus moderate or high mental well-being for SWEMWebs, and languishing versus flourishing or moderately mentally healthy for MHCSF. So next, we sought to identify which set of factors best predict mental well-being, specifically in our sample of Ukrainian returnees. And to do so, we built logistic regression models employing forward stepwise selection. So the variables that were assessed in the bivariate analyses, excluding the region of origin in Ukraine, were considered for inclusion and then sequentially added to these models based on the Akaike information criterion. The dependent variables for these models were the dichotomized mental health outcomes. We ran robustness checks and also reran the models with the continuous SWEMWebs and MHCSF scores with robust standard errors to see whether we get the same results or not. You can go ahead, Mateusz. So first, I would like to present some key bivariate results. And in the coming slide, note that bar plots in red relate to SWEMWebs, whereas bar plots in green, as the one you see here, relate to MHCSF outcomes. That way you could perhaps quickly visualize which of the two measures we are actually discussing, since going over all of them would require quite a bit of time. So one key result is that these basic individual demographic characteristics, and here I'm thinking of age, gender, marital status, caregiving, were not associated with mental health outcomes. On the other hand, higher education appears to provide protection against low mental well-being and languishing mental health. So in figure 1 here, you could see that among those with a master's degree or higher, 22% were languishing, whereas this percentage increases to 48 among those with secondary education, both who completed it or with unfinished secondary education. And this relationship is likely mediated by things such as access to information, networks, and access to better employment opportunities. Mateusz, if you'd like, you might need to click more than once. So, yeah, the next one. Now we move on to employment. And as you can see in figure 2 here, those who are unemployed, among them, 57% had low mental well-being, whereas this percentage was 33% among those who were employed. And this is a drop of about 24 percentage points. And if you look at the MHCSF results, you'd find that they are even greater. So that's a difference of 29 percentage points. So we can clearly see that employment is protective at the bivariate level at this point, is protective against poor mental well-being and languishing mental health. And it's important to keep in mind here that employment not only offers income, which is essential, of course, but also structure and a sense of usefulness in society. So something to keep in mind. Now, the association between financial security and mental well-being was even more pronounced. So if you look at figure 4, you'll find that among those with enough money to cover their basic daily needs, 14% were classified as languishing, compared to a very large 52% among those reporting not having enough money to cover their basic needs. So that would be a difference of 38 percentage points. And important to note here that similar results were found using SWEMWebs with a, albeit smaller, percentage difference of 33 between the two groups. Perceived safety was also found to be associated with mental health outcomes. And as you can see here in figure 5, among those who reported feeling unsafe or very unsafe, 48% had low mental well-being, compared with about 37% and 32% among those who reported feeling neutral or safe or very safe. And this is a significant finding, obviously implying that insecurity not only affects exposure to physical risk and physical harm, but impacts mental well-being and psychological functioning. And next, I'd like us to discuss, or I'd like to mention really 3 mobility and return related variables. The first of which are intentions. So as you can see in the graph here, those who planned to stay in their current location long-term, among them 23% were languishing, compared to 58% among those who did not plan to stay in their current location long-term. And this association was significant. Next up, and even more interesting, in my opinion at least, is the date and the time of arrival in Ukraine. So we found that recent returnees reported worse well-being compared to those who had arrived earlier. And this is even more pronounced between those who had arrived more than a year ago and those who arrived within the last 3 months, of course, at the time of data collection. But it's important also to note here, this result was significant only on the SWEMWebs scale, implying that the effect of the date of arrival is probably more related to everyday calm and coping optimism rather than longer-term psychological flourishing. And we also found that mobility patterns are associated with mental well-being. No, specifically rather with the mental health outcomes of MHCSF, so languishing, flourishing, etc. So as you can see here in figure 8, among those who had engaged in short-term cross-border travel, 18% were languishing, compared to about 37% among those who had stayed in Ukraine. At the same time, you can see that those who had relocated for longer periods of time showed levels that are rather similar to those who had stayed in the country. And what this really tells us is that specifically short-term cross-border mobility may function as a household or individual adaptive strategy. In that sense, it could signal access to financial means, documentation, transnational networks, or an ability to adapt to worsening or changing conditions in Ukraine. And this was also reinforced through the qualitative interviews, where many participants indicated return not necessarily as the end of displacement, but rather as an ongoing adaptive strategy. And you could think here or remind yourselves of the quotes that Mateusz mentioned about keeping their flats abroad, for instance, and deciding perhaps to go back when the shelling restarts, or keeping in mind this kind of cross-border continuous movement between Ukraine and other countries in Europe. But here, if we look at those who had relocated and those who have anticipated relocation or are planning to leave, we find that psychological strain is higher among these groups, 50% and 39%. And this means that this effect of mobility is not uniformly protective, and it very well depends on the form of movement, on its duration, voluntariness, among other factors. So what affects mobility? In our sample, we found that mobility patterns were associated with temporary protection status. More specifically, as you can see in figure 9, 59% of those who had relocated had temporary protection, compared with 20% among those who had engaged in short-term travel and 15% among those who had stayed in Ukraine. So while temporary protection is associated with mobility and enables mobility, the psychological effects of movement, as we've seen in the previous slide, really depend on its form, on its duration, legal safeguards, and other factors. Now, that being said, without temporary protection, movements may occur without such safeguards, increasing, perhaps having them lose access to their services, or having them residing irregularly in these countries, ultimately really leading to heightened vulnerability. So next, I'd like to quickly present the multivariate analysis results. And here you can see the output of our logistic regression models. You could see the adjusted odds ratios along with 95% confidence intervals, as well as the p-values. And a few key things I wanted to highlight with this table, not to burden you with all the numbers. Tables are really, they need time to digest properly, in my opinion. But here, I would direct your attention, and before I do so, you could notice that the rows in light green, they are the variables that were retained through the forward selection algorithm. And the first thing that I would point to is the fact that financial security was consistently the strongest predictor of mental health outcomes. And more specifically in this case, the odds of low mental well-being among those who had enough resources to meet their basic needs were 69% less than those who did not. And this result is rather similar for languishing and classified through MHCSF. Similarly, you see that employment and planning to stay in your current location long-term are also protective against languishing mental health. And important to note in this table is that employment, again, measured here, specifically I'm focusing on the languishing column. Employment was independently protective. So that's important to keep in mind, as an independent of financial security and your ability to meet your daily needs. But its effect was weaker than that of financial security, suggesting that it matters more, perhaps, that you have enough income to fulfill your daily needs. Next slide, Mateusz. So the linear regression models reinforced these results, and they are rather consistent with those of the logistic regression models. Two things I could perhaps highlight is that for SWAMWebs, employment status and considering moving back to the previous country of residence became statistically significant. And concerning the latter variable, it implies that those who are considering moving back to their previous country of residence have a lower SWAMWebs score. Concerning those of MHCSF, they point to the same direction as the findings that were obtained with the logistic regression models. So I think this gives you a rough idea of our findings. Obviously, the details are all in the report, and I would love to answer your questions about these. And for any other questions you might have on Upinion, our digital engagement platform, or these results, you can reach out to me or to my colleague, Augustine Hack, who had contributed quite a lot to this work as well. So thank you, and I hand it over back to you, Mateusz.
Thank you, Tarek. Thank you, Pim. Thank you, Afra. I understand that was also like we had a lot of information shared to you today, so I follow Tarek with inviting you to read a whole report. But maybe as a final takeaway, the 3-4 points that you more from the policy perspective that we need to keep in mind when we are discussing the return intentions, and the return situations. Are as follows, and I will allow myself briefly to mention them, and they are coming directly from all the findings of our study, and we are also referring to them in the policy brief of our report. So first of all, return is driven by constraint abroad rather than improved conditions in Ukraine, and we had it in all of our really qualitative interviews that we conducted with people who are returnees. They were mostly citing quite difficult conditions living in European Union countries, uncertainty related to the temporary protection, often loss of temporary housing. That was the situation, for example, in Poland that I was referring, and having the need to compete in the private rental market with a quite often precarious employment, which was increasingly difficult for people. Of course, also we are aware that the situation when it comes to the hosting of people with refugee experience from Ukraine in EU is being increasingly conditional, and also it's becoming more difficult regarding also the social cohesion part, which also influence the idea of how people from Ukraine can actually develop their lives back in European Union countries, and especially the most vulnerable, as we also were seeing for the category of caregiving, is often pushing people to return. So that's, I think we need to keep in mind that it's often not improved conditions in Ukraine as we would like to see from the perspective of recovery, but rather difficult conditions in the EU country. We need to keep in mind the care structure and gender profile that we were having. We have mostly people who are predominantly female, working age, and having caregiving responsibilities. So of course that is putting a significant strain of how actually we can think about this group taking part in recovery efforts, but also to the fact that they simply have caregiving responsibilities, right? So that's also something that they take care of their own or their social network rather than state-supported caregiving functions, which is of course something that puts this group in a specific vulnerability position. What Tarek mentioned, I think it's quite important that we have financial security over employment as a predictor of well-being, and even though employment was indeed protective, financial security was significantly more, and that is happening with the situation when we have quite widespread occupational downgrades. So 54% of our survey respondents said that they work below their qualification. They have quite significant income insecurity. And as I said, it's the strongest predictor of mental well-being. Contrary to the traditional literature, and I think that is something that we should take out from this report, is this part of the mobility factor. Indeed, our research suggested that if people have the ability to move back to Europe. And I think what is important, it says that it was significant when we're talking about this short-term mobility, for example, less than a month. Then it becomes a protective adaptive resources. So not really we're talking about people who came back to Ukraine and they decided to fully come back later to EU, but we are still having this intention to stay in Ukraine, but having an ability to move back. For example, that just to visit their family, or maybe they are engaged in the hybrid work, or other reasons that makes them able to move. Often in the literature we see that if people moved after their return, it's often significant some kind of event that pushed them again to move. But here we rather see this as a form of adaptive resources. But often, of course, this exists only if they have a legal possibility to move, which is again why we are having a quite significant importance of temporary protection. That is results of the mental well-being. So we see that aspects related to agency and a kind of like mental well-being are quite strong. So people are functioning, they are making decisions, they are problem solving. That also translates into the fact that they are of the working age, that they are having caregiving responsibilities, they need to be making decisions. But of course, they are coping against the circumstances, not because of them. So they experience a low level of optimism, calm, and social trust. So the social aspect of their well-being is something of a serious point of concern. And I think that is another thing that we didn't yet fail to mention, is the fact that their support so far, when we've been asking them about the support system that they received, is mostly coming from private or informal networks, because nearly 70% of returnees report receiving no formal assistance, and over 76% don't know about any assistance programs. And when they were citing receiving an assistance, they were citing receiving an assistance related to not necessarily their status as a returnees, but maybe, for example, because they are receiving pension, for example, and that this was the form of support that they are receiving, not necessarily related to the fact that they are returnees. And there are, of course, many takeaways that you can take from this report in each of your different fields, but I think important to mention that we are not seeing return as a point of no return when we have a very binary return or stay. We are seeing this much more as a mobility. Much more people are considering returning, are considering moving, and ability to move is actually something that is protective for their mental well-being. Housing affordability, healthcare access, job placement. So all these things related to the financial security and basic needs that people were not able to take care of. Indeed, if they have enough financial security, they can take care of their needs, but also take into account the fact that, for example, aspects that they are not able to meet in their basic needs was, for example, in the 70% healthcare, which is also something provided by the state. So either we have a situation where the state is in the conditions to support people, or we have a situation when people have to take care of themselves, and this is when the financial security plays a most important role. And of course, the most important is this safeguarding of legal reversibility. So people have an ability to move and are being able to be mobile as a protective factor only if they have a legal status to do so. And I think this is something that comes with a lot of uncertainty related to the temporary protection of whether they will have an ability of return, of the secondary displacement, or whether we'll be indeed having a situation of rather more dangerous secondary displacement when people, for example, move back to Ukraine, but due to the circumstances there, they will be forced to return to EU. However, then they will be no longer having a protection status. And maybe with this takeaway, I will close our discussion. I invite you to read the full report on our website, but now if there is any questions, any points of discussions, please feel free to ask, and I'll also take a look at the chat in the meantime. But if there is anybody who has any questions or any reflections, please feel free to raise your hand. don't see any hand risen, but I think we have one question in the chat. Finding unemployment status. Is this possible that employed person who decided to return were working remotely by being employed by an entity in Ukraine, or were they employed in hosting countries and decided to go back? So regarding the mobility factors, I believe among some of our interviews we had the situations when people were, for example, employed in a hybrid working modes, right? So like people were, for example, working in, but that was not necessary. That was many different working placements. So for example, they were working not necessarily related to, for example, Ukrainian companies, but maybe some international companies that they were working remotely regarding the place of their residence. Of course, a significant amount of people were wanting to, for example, return due to some circumstances related to recovery. I think the aspects of identity or willingness to contribute to the recovery was a significant one. People were still forming also connections between Ukraine and the place of their residence. I think that is something significant, that if you look at the number of people who are contributing one way or another to Ukrainian recovery while they're being in the form of displacement, I think in Netherlands we have quite a lot of examples of this type of initiatives and organizations of people who are actually working cross-country. For working cross-country, for example, architects in Netherlands, we have one of those organizations. So I think not necessarily as a motivation to return, and return with the intention to stay. I think this is something different that we are also taking into account. We are looking at the people who came with the intention to stay, but we found out that the mobility is a significant factor. Yeah. I don't know if some of my colleagues would like to contribute to this.
There's a question by Irina.
Oh, yes. Irina, go ahead.
Hi, everybody. I'm sorry. I don't think you could see me.
No, we see you perfectly.
Oh, lovely. So, Irina Lapshina, Ukrainian Catholic University. And first of all, congratulations, guys, with excellent research. I really enjoy listening to this and looking forward to reading to the full report. I was wondering whether you had a chance to ask your respondents about their perceptions of host countries before their mobility, because in our project EU Imagine, which we have done more than 10 years ago, where we look at migration aspirations of Ukrainians and migration perception of different European countries, we found out that actually migration aspirations are shaped by migration perceptions. And to give you an example, say Germany, this is had sort of a golden image, and people believe that you don't need to lock your bicycle, they can't be stolen, all the rest. And also I recently did research of forced migrants in Germany, and I talked to them. It was basically qualitative interviews. And when I asked why have you chosen Germany, not Poland? And then people said me that they had basically relatives or friends in different countries. And one guy said, I talked to my uncle in Israel and then to my aunt in Germany. And the aunt in Germany convinced me and said, look, apart from excellent healthcare and everything, you could drink here Coke without any problems with your stomach, without any health issues. So this rosy golden perceptions of Germany. And then people were disillusioned once being in Germany. So whether you look at these perceptions, aspiration factors, and also return aspirations, then thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Irina. Very, very intriguing and interesting questions. We did not make this as a separate inquiry when we were doing qualitative interviews. We also didn't have it in our survey. However, it did come up in some of our other research that we do in Opera Foundation. So that is quite interesting. And it also came up during the qualitative interviews when we are going through kind of a timeline of the people's lives. So like because we were doing this in a qualitative way, quite holistic and open. So of course, different aspects came about, including different factors that made them be present in one of the European countries. But that was mostly in relationship to, for example, missed expectations. So for example, like indeed, a lot of people, a majority were coming because of some connections, right? So I think Poland is quite significant in this aspect, because indeed there was quite a big, first of all, it was the first country that people went to, but there, because also there was a quite significant network there. But often, for example, in one of our other projects, we had people who, when we were investigating the situation in Italy, who were quoting the issue of healthcare in Italy as a reasons why they chose to go to Italy, or for example in Netherlands, because of the English language, ability to speak English language, and they thought that okay, even though it's Dutch, I can maybe like make some connections there. So that was indeed significant. And then often the missed expectations. So thinking that, for example, healthcare is so good in Italy, so I chose to go there, but then other factors are coming into the light that, okay, this is not what I expected. And then it's often putting people in more precarious conditions. Regarding aspirations when it comes to return to Ukraine, well, that is a very difficult, and I think we are conducting right now another study in the Netherlands about the return intentions to return intentions to Ukraine, under what conditions. And I think here there is, I wouldn't necessarily mention a word of aspirations. I think like that is quite tricky to take it into this account, right? Because people are often quoting push factors as reasons for their mobility decisions rather than a significant aspect of aspirations. Although I think what's also connected with the Justyna previous questions about the labor market, we do see, and I think that is also related to overall temporal aspects of, like, it's been already over 4 years since the war started, and less people are quoting that they have a specific intentions to return. But what is increasing is that people also build some kind of a capital in which they would like to still be connected to Ukraine, right? And I think more and more organizations are working in this kind of a hybrid mode where, for example, they are working and living in Poland and Netherlands, but they work on the issues related to Ukraine, either in reconstruction or recovery or connections with the diaspora organizations. So I think there's more and more this type of dimensions, which is, I think again, something which you could frame in relations to aspirations, right? Aspire to contribute to the country's recovery. And then the big question is how exactly I can do that. And I think that was something of a pre-motive of our study, exactly to investigate under which conditions people are actually able to do that. Thank you. Roman, go ahead.
Yes, hi, my name is Roman Makucha. I'm the project manager at ICMPD, International Center for Migration Policy Development. And big congratulations and thank you very much. It was very lovely to listen, and I really look forward to read the entire report. Since we are now running 6 Ukrainian consultation centers in the countries that receive the majority of Ukrainians, in Poland, Czech Republic, and Poland, and Germany, we are working directly with the people under temporary protection. And listening to the report, what would be your suggestion at like these 3 levels for messaging? Because we were talking like recently about the expectations, and at these 3 levels, at the EU level, because we know that the temporary protection will end in March next year, and there are some options on the table, but it's not yet decided. At the Ukrainian level, and at the separate EU member states level as the hosting countries, specifically in terms of managing expectations and connecting that to the clear messaging. This is one side, if you can comment that and give your recommendation and your vision based on the data that you've collected. And the other point, looking into potential future returns and the conditions at the community or Hromada level in Ukraine. So what would be your takeaway with regards to the possibility of these go and see visits? And would you support this idea? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Roman. Indeed, I will start with the second question because that was also something that we discussed quite a lot, and I think like there is that's also our report show we've been discussing, and because again like the aspects of return here is well, it's not directly return, as I said before. We have a quite significant aspect of these mobility factors. And then we were wondering, because as we have a significant amount of the mobility factors, you can, I guess, imagine this wait and see framework to be actually working currently, because people are visiting their families. Like 2 weeks ago, we had one members of our team who were just picked up in a place in the office in the Netherlands and drove to Ukraine. So people have the feeling of understanding more or less the situation, what is there. And we assumed before that makes them have a proper information about the conditions in Ukraine, and then that translates into their ability to make a good decisions, being connected, staying in touch, having a social network. However, like what we had in this aspects of, again, our sample, there's a difference between going and seeing, and I think intentions to return and to stay, especially if you have dependents. So I think like we have also among our groups some representative from the NGOs who are working in Ukraine. So I think maybe perhaps somebody would like to comment on that. I think there's people from Rokada who work significantly on this topic. But that, I think, showcase a little bit the difference that when you are actually coming to stay and you have, for example, your family, and then you have this moment where you are experiencing shilling, maybe that you didn't experience before, but you kind of are related to it because you've been for a short time visit, right? So then having ability to quickly come back is giving you this protective framework, but then to fully stay, then I think like there is a quite more significant investment needed when it comes to information provision and protection provision, and perhaps not just waiting and seeing, but more being connected with and supporting the capacity strengthening of the organizations who work on site with these issues right now would be more important, and however they are connected with the Unity hubs and so on, because often, I guess, this expectation management, right? People have certain expectations related to the return, but because of the network, because of the information, but it's different, I think, when you then experience it fully. And especially if you don't have, again, legal stay to return if something happens. I think that's different when you are a decision maker, a care provider for the dependents, that you need to prioritize their safety. And then if you do so, there are completely different factors into consideration than something that you can really swing by a short mobility visit. Then it's just, a feeling that you need to go through, and probably having a guidance by somebody who advises on this topic and who lives with the people who are actually experiencing displacement and returning would be an option. And that was the second question. And your first was about the potential solutions or recommendations related. And I think a little bit I touched upon that, right, in response to my second question. Right now, there is, I think, a significant amount of uncertainty related to the future and what people are supposed to be doing. In different member states, I think Poland is already introducing temporary solution, Czech Republic also. But a lot of people are considering returning because they have no idea what will be. Can they switch to another status? And I think on the member states, that is a a gap that is significantly needed to be fixed, because even from the perspective of, we can know in a more policymaker section that like probably people will not be deported, but people don't necessarily know that. So if they don't know that, they plan their lives with the question mark. But then having the idea, okay, there will be some pathways forward, even if it's still ambiguous what exactly it will entail, is again a strategy forward. And I think like having ability to, people are looking for the information, how they contribute. That's what I was saying before. Potentially Unity hubs are also a way to do that, to stay connected. And then people are seeking a way how they can contribute to recovery, to organizations, how can they be useful in the process. But because, for example, of the dependence, they cannot move back. So creating more and more options for, I think, what OECD called a dual intent approach, where you are fostering and supporting integration in the member states while having ability to return while the conditions allow, but you are maintaining the ties one way or another by the labor market integration, economic support, social connections, is a way to go. But the problem is how to actually make it structure. And then, of course, Unity hubs and all the work that you are doing in ICMPD comes quite significantly also forward. But that's from me. If there is any other questions or reflections from other of our speakers or participants, feel free. Okay, I think we reached the end of our time. You will receive the presentation on email. You will also receive the full report on your email. We invite you to stay in touch. I think there's like the most important part is after the study to think how it can be translated into the practice. We maintain this event to be more descriptive about how study was made and to go a little bit more details about it. But I think like the recommendations and the findings part of our report is quite significant. So please feel free to read it through, to take a look. We also not only made a big report that has like every 70, 80 pages, but we also did a 15 pages brochure of this finding that you can also find on the website, that we'll also send you for email, which can be a little bit easier snapshot into the most important findings of this research. We thank you very much for staying with us for over an hour and a half, for your questions, and good luck with all your work that you do on this topic. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.